The Nintendo Switch is great, but comparing it to the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, it is pretty underpowered. But this does make sense. The Nintendo Switch is portable, and Nintendo's never really cared about making a really strong console ever since the Wii. So this led to a lot of developers to opt out for making games on Nintendo consoles. During the Wii era though, a lot of developers still tried to get their games on Wii if they could, because, well, a lot of people had Wiis, so the audience was massive. But overall, a lot of developers would just prefer to make games on the PlayStation and Xbox, because they wanted to utilize the new, stronger hardware. During the Wii era, we didn't really see a lot of these games because, one, the Wii U was weaker than its competition, and two, the Wii U didn't really sell that well. So why would a developer try to make a game for the Wii U when the audience wasn't really there and there'd be a lot of time to get it onto the Wii U? But with the Switch, the audience is massive. So developers are trying to get their games back on Nintendo consoles with the Switch, but the Switch is still underpowered. So these developers are trying whatever they can to get these games on Switch, no matter the compromises.
Just because a game is on both Switch and PlayStation doesn't mean that the Switch version is a worse version. Sonic Mania, for example, runs perfectly on whichever console, since it's not that demanding of a game, which makes sense. Then you have those games that have very small differences when they're brought to Switch or a more powerful console. Persona 5 Royal was originally only on the PlayStation 4, but when they brought it over to all other consoles, they improved the game to be 60 FPS, except for the Nintendo Switch version and the Xbox One version. The Xbox One version makes sense since it's comparable to the PlayStation 4, however, the Switch isn't as powerful as those two, so in addition to remaining at 30 FPS, it saw a cut to some visuals. However, these are very small reductions in quality. You can play Persona 5 Royal on any console and have the same experience. However, when I'm talking about the Switch version, I'm talking about those games that you'd never see running on a Nintendo Switch, but they are. The first game I always think of whenever I'm thinking of the Switch version of a game is Doom from 2016. When I found out this game was coming to the Switch, I was shocked. Not only was the game something I never thought I'd see running on a Nintendo console, yet alone something that was portable, but I was also shocked because this was a big game, not only in terms of content, but also storage size. The Switch internal storage was only 32 gigabytes, so I was concerned if this game would chew a big chunk of storage. Well, we were in luck. Kind of. If you bought Doom physically, the whole single player was on the cart ready to play the second you put it in. If you wanted to play the multiplayer, you had to download the update, which was over 8 gigabytes. 8 gigabytes is a big ask for someone when the internal storage is only 32 gigabytes. But for most people, they only wanted to play the single player, and the ability to have the choice not to download a part of the game you don't plan on playing was a huge help. Now, if you got the game digitally, you'd have to download everything, and looking at the eShop, it says the game file size is 22 gigabytes. That is wild. That is over half of the storage of the console. I am aware you can upgrade the storage of the Switch using a micro SD card, or even the OLED model, which has a bigger internal storage with 64 gigabytes. But 22 gigabytes was a huge ask, when the only Switch model at the time had 32 gigabytes of internal storage. And even now with the OLED model, the game is a third of the total storage. Getting down to the most important part, how does the game play? Well, there were compromises here, and a lot of them. The game gets its frame rate dropped from 60 FPS to 30 FPS. The resolution gets a huge reduction, a ton of game graphics get a reduction in quality, and load times take longer. That's a lot of compromises, and some of them are pretty drastic. And the biggest one that I didn't even mention is, how does the game perform? Even with all the reductions, the game still goes below 30 FPS, mainly in really busy areas with a lot going on. Between all the reductions to quality and how the Switch still has a hard time running the game, I would say this isn't the best version of the game. That part is obvious. However, even with all the compromises, if this was the only console you owned that had Doom 2016 on it, and you're not one for graphics and you don't mind frame drops, this is honestly not a terrible way to play the game. Overwatch was another interesting one when it was announced. Overwatch has always been a PC game first, with the console versions just feeling like another way to play it. The console versions already had some compromises, but nothing massive. But now they were putting it on the Nintendo Switch, something much weaker than the consoles they already had it on. So, what were the changes? Well, it was the core 4. Frame rate lowered from 60 to 30, resolution lowered, game graphics lowered, and an increase in load times. Do all of these changes help make the game run good? Well, it's obviously not the best version, that part is clear, but the game in this state is playable and still enjoyable. Overwatch would have a massive storage size compared to the internal storage of the Switch. That's okay though. They released a physical version that would help reduce the amount of game that needs to be downloaded. Never mind. They released a physical edition that only has a code in it for the full game download, and 3 months of Switch Online. Now, I would check how big Overwatch is, but I can't, because Overwatch 2 completely replaced it. Speaking of Overwatch 2, how does it run? Well, it's basically the same as the first one, has all the same compromises and performs very similarly. Surprisingly, Overwatch on the Switch isn't just a lower quality version of the game. It actually has a feature exclusive to it, the ability for using the gyro of the Switch controllers to aim in the game. Another thing that was honestly interesting is when player models were loading, you could see them as floating blue orbs. Up until this point in Overwatch, on other platforms, if a player model was taking a while to load, it would just be completely invisible. I think the Switch is what caused the game to display these blue orbs for loading player models, as from here on out, they would appear on all versions whenever a player model is taking a while to load.
The Switch version doesn't mean it's a bad version. However, it's very clear that these games were not designed around the Nintendo Switch hardware. Now, the games that I mentioned, yes, they all have compromises, but in the end, I would say they're all playable on the Nintendo Switch. Is there anything wrong with buying these Nintendo Switch versions? Not at all. Until I realized that I bought Doom 2016 on the Nintendo Switch for $80 when it was new, when on the same day I could have bought it for $20 on the PlayStation 4. $60 more for a worse version of the game.